and have fun.
Thanks, Heather. Awesome, guys. Welcome to a Coffee Roaster's Guide to Fermentations and Processing. My name is Joseph Stazone, and I'm the owner of Cafe Creole. I started Cafe Creole 11 years ago. We're a coffee importing and roasting company. We work directly with producers on post-harvest process, on importing. We sell green coffee to roasters, and we own a roastery in Virginia. I started it back in 2012 after a trip to Haiti with my church. It was after the earthquake. 15 of us went down to Haiti, and we paid about $1,000 a person to go down there for a week, and we ended up painting walls. And I witnessed a place that had some of the most poverty I've ever experienced in my life, and I felt like our $15,000 collectively could have been spent much differently to make an impact in Haiti. Before we left, we took duffel bags of shoes, used shoes from the United States, because everybody in Haiti needs your old shoes, and we dumped them out in a marketplace. And this woman started crying nearby, so I went to talk with her with my translator. She said, I got a loan from the bank in Port-au-Prince to buy and sell shoes very affordably in this market, and you just gave everybody a free pair. She said, you're not helping as much as you think. So that impacted me quite a bit. And I flew back from Haiti with my team, and 2 days later, against everybody's advice, I went back there by myself. I bought a motorcycle, and I started going through the mountains and learning Haitian Creole, and kind of casting a vision to producers that were growing coffee of how we can create employment. That's how our company was born, and we do still have our primary focus being Haiti, but we have direct trade business model that's similar in about 12 other origins as well. And the mission remains to create sustainable employment using specialty coffee. The reason that I couldn't have used charity to help there, and charity is a good thing, so is aid. Aid is a good thing as well. When an earthquake happens, when a tsunami happens, it's not necessarily a good thing 14 years later when we're still importing containers of rice and that country grows rice. People are going out of business. And the last statistic taken in Haiti was in 2012 that said they were over 65% unemployed. And a lot of that is due to us giving aid for things that they already produced there. So I kind of vowed at that point that I had to create sustainable employment. And what makes something sustainable in the vision that I was casting? We have environmental sustainability and economic, and they're both important. We're talking specifically about economic sustainability. And in my vision, this would be a person purchasing a product for the value that it costs because they want to purchase it, not because they feel bad for wherever they're purchasing it from or the story, strictly because the product is what they want to purchase for that price. I'm not talking about the $25 bracelet that you bought from a woman in Kenya because you felt bad because it's not worth $25. We're talking about a product that somebody wants to purchase for that price. And that's why I had to choose specialty coffee to use, because it allowed me to pay enough to my producers and still have my consumers back here be willing to pay this amount regardless of whether they care about the work that we were doing. That creates a sustainable system. Briefly about myself and my background. I have a background in botany, in crossbreeding plants, a little bit of illegal chemistry. I'm a licensed Q grader and have been for about 10 years now. And I'm a CQI lecturer. I've judged in the Bolivian presidential tournament. This is like their kind of knockoff of the Cup of Excellence 6 times now. And I'll be observing in the Cup of Excellence Honduras in a couple months. I've been a post-harvest process technician at Cafe Creole besides all the other jobs that an owner of a business has to do for 11 years now. And I don't think I'm an expert on processing or fermentations, but I will say that I have been doing this for over a decade, and I go to Origin more than once or twice a month. So I've been able to experience a lot and see what works and doesn't work, and I'm really excited to be able to share that with you guys today. As Heather said, we were named 2023 Macro Roaster of the Year from Roast Magazine. And last year, Roast also published a study that we completed that I co-authored with one of my team members on the CO2 off-gassing of coffee after it's roasted and the sensory perception. And I presented on that as well at the Roast Summit in Seattle. Again, we kind of have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump in here. We're going to talk about coffee harvesting and the anatomy of a coffee fruit. We're going to go into the fermentation, the types of fermentation, That beginning 30% of the presentation, I'm going to need you to bear with me a little bit. There's a lot of scientific terms and chemistry that we're going to be talking about. I don't need you to walk away understanding exactly what galactronic acid is. What I'd like you to understand is basically why certain flavors are being created, and as a roaster or as a coffee shop owner, what you can do to best bring those out and experience them. We're going to go into the processing methods after that, a little bit about experimental processing, how we can be tasting that. We're going to go through a few case studies on how we can be tasting that and sampling those coffees, and a very brief roast concepts that we'll talk about at the end. So coffee is harvested at different times of the year depending on the hemisphere. Northern hemisphere is typically earlier in the year. Southern hemisphere is typically later in the year. I want to be clear that we're talking specifically about Arabica today. It doesn't mean that a lot of these principles would not apply to Robusta as well, but we're not talking about that. And the chemical compounds are pretty different, so there's a chance that some of them would not apply. You can see that the caffeine is higher in Robusta. The chlorogenic acid is significantly higher. That's what causes bitterness. The sugar content in Arabica is a lot higher, and that's necessary for a lot of the things we're discussing today in the fermentation process. Trigonylene is something that carries aromas and allows it to amplify, and that's higher in Arabica as well. So coffee is a shrub, and this shrub produces fruits. We call them coffee cherries. This fruit has two seeds that are facing each other inside of the coffee fruit. That's why they're flat on one side and rounded on the other ones, with the exception of pea berry, which would be those two kind of coming together and creating one seed within the coffee fruit. The things we need to know on here today, the outer skin is obviously holding everything into the fruit. We have our flesh or our meat or our pulp. We have our coffee seed on the inside, and just outside of that coffee seed, we have our parchment. It's a paper-like substance. In Spanish, it's pergamino, and that's going to be kind of in between that mucilage and the coffee seed. Now, in between that parchment and the pulp, there's also a pectin layer. We're going to talk a little bit about this. So this shrub has not produced anything yet, but it's growing. It's now flowering. These flowers start to turn to fruits. The fruits are produced right outside of the flowers, and they're going to be hard at first. They're going to be green. They're not sweet, just like most fruits that are not ripe. But as that fruit begins to mature, a few things are going to take place. The pigments inside of that fruit are going to begin to change from green typically to red. They might change to other colors as well, depending on the coffee variety. At the same time, enzymes inside of that coffee fruit are going to begin to break down the pectin. Again, we're going to zoom up on that in a second. And it's going to create a hydrogel. This hydrogel is really rich in sugar, but it's important to note that it's not soluble. It doesn't dissolve in water, and therefore it's not easily absorbed yet into the seed, okay? What is pectin? Pectin is a main component in all cell walls of plants. It's holding them together. It's also in things like chewing gum. Pectin is in a lot of things, but in this specific circumstance, it's holding the cell walls together in that layer outside of the parchment and inside of the mucilage. It's a polysaccharide, so what you need to think about there is like carbohydrates with lots of sugars, okay? And it's rich in something called galactronic acid. Galactronic acid is a sweet acid. When it oxidizes, when it's exposed to oxygen, it can feed bacteria to create alcohol and acids. Okay, so let's define what fermentation is. Fermentation is the chemical breakdown of a substance by bacteria, yeasts, or other microorganisms involving effervescence and the giving off of heat. Let's kind of just simplify that here. Creation of alcohols and acids from sugars and starches. We're not talking about brewing beer, though. We're talking about coffee. So what's happening during plant fermentation specifically? The sucrose inside of it is being eaten by bacteria. Microorganisms are eating that, and they're creating glucose. This glucose is soluble. That's called biosynthesis, when the microorganisms are breaking down the plant matter. We also have something called hydrolysis. That's where liquids, the moisture inside of the fruit, is also breaking down the sucrose and turning it into glucose. Again, this is when it's starting to become soluble. This also allows that mucilage to start to separate from the seed. The pectin's breaking down, the mucilage can separate. This is essential for being able to get that off of our coffee seed or coffee bean. There's also a number of heat and enzyme-related activities. If you've ever had a compost pile and you turn that compost pile and you feel that heat coming off, that's the fermentation taking place. That's the plant fermentation. So now that this glucose is soluble, it can start to be absorbed into the coffee seed. During the fermentation period, the biosynthesis, the hydrolysis, those sugars are also created or converted into several acids. The ones I want to talk about are malic, citric, and acetic. Malic acid is going to have that green apple taste, that green apple acidity in your coffee. Citric is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to have a citrus taste, lemon, lime. Acetic acid is kind of the weird one here. Acetic acid has a very vinegar smell to it. If you've ever been to like an apple orchard to go apple picking and there's all the ones that are left on the ground and you have that vinegar smell taking place, that's an acetic fermentation that's happening. That's acetic acid being created. You don't typically want that in coffee, but a tiny bit of it actually amplifies a lot of the other flavors. So having some is a good thing. When you're doing post-harvest process, the balance that's taking place is how much sugar do I want to remain in the coffee? What acids am I creating during that time? And minimizing that acetic acid at the same time. And that balance is how we create that perfect cup during the post-harvest process. So we're going to talk about two types of fermentation today. There's actually a couple different ways of explaining this. So for the sake of integrity, I don't want to throw you guys off with a bunch of terms here, but there's a lactic fermentation, there's acetic, and there's alcohol. Those can take place within these two that are an umbrella above that. And we're going to talk about these two specific types of fermentation today. All three of those can take place during an aerobic fermentation. Aerobic is with the presence of oxygen. This is typically very easy for producers or post-harvest process technicians to engineer this type of a fermentation with coffee because oxygen is already present. All they need to do is monitor it and have it in an area where it can be done consistently. This is heterogeneous, and what that means is it's going to happen at different intensities and different speeds throughout the batch. That means we cannot do it for as long while remaining consistent with our coffee quality, okay? This can't be done for as long because it's happening at different intensities and different speeds. Then we have anaerobic fermentation, and only a lactic fermentation can take place in an anaerobic because it doesn't require oxygen. Without oxygen present, this is going to be homogeneous if it's done correctly, meaning the same speed and the same intensity. It's a little bit harder for producers to engineer this. They're going to need to have large metal, possibly like wine tanks or things like that, anywhere you can get the oxygen out, allow for gas to degas out of the tank, and remove the oxygen. The other note I want to make here is that gallic-catronic acid we talked about, that when it oxidizes, brings forth certain acids, it's not oxidizing because oxygen is not present. That means we can now do an extremely long fermentation without creating acetic acid, or at least not as quickly. That means we can go from doing something that's 8 hours long all the way up to, let's say, 72 hours for an anaerobic fermentation. The fermentation period needs to be monitored very strictly. And I was just in Honduras last week, and it was really amazing to see this because I work with producers all over the world. And a lot of times you go and you observe things and you say, this is going to bring inconsistency. Let me show you why. Let's test the pH in these two things. You see why this is different. And then you leave and you come back 6 months later, a year later, and nothing has been done differently. I was in Marcala, and it had been 2 years since I've been able to visit these producers because I've been very busy in other origins that needed me a little bit more. And I went there and they had done literally everything that I had asked and more. And they were taking complete records of the pH, the temperature, the time, and the probable sugar content, which is done with a meter that can test the sugars. Now, to be clear, time is not a measurement of the fermentation. It's a factor that's affecting it. A lot of times at origin, this image here is in the Congo where I was trying to explain how to test for the pH, because the pH and the sugar content are actual measurements. A lot of producers go specifically on time. I stopped picking the coffee. I depulped the coffee at 6 p.m. and at 8 a.m. we go through the washing period. So it's based on time. Well, what happens when the temperature is different every night? The coffee is going to ferment faster or slower. So when that happens, I typically spend about a week with someone and show them how it's different with the different temperatures based on pH. And then they can visualize, wow, this was a 4.5 and this one was a 3.8. It fermented much longer. Keeping those records though, like they were doing in Marcala, Honduras, is amazing because we can then take all of those lots, we can cup them, and if there was a problem, we can look back and learn from it. We can find out what was causing this. How do we avoid it in the future? Or if there's something amazing that happened, what can we learn from this and how can we replicate it? Great, so now we are done with that kind of scientific stuff. We're gonna go directly into our processing, okay? The wash process is where the coffee fruit is stripped and it is washed off with the seed. Green fruits need to be sorted out. Those fruits are not ripe. The sugar content in them is less. It's going to affect your cup. Coffee that floats to the top of water as well is sorted out because there's typically insect damage or some sort of rotting that's taken place. That's going to be the same for the next two processes we talk about as well. So I'm going to skip that when talking about the next ones. Now the coffee is depulped, meaning the fruit is removed. And then while the mucilage is on it, it's fermented. Some people will teach you that's the exact way to do it. Now, after working at Origin for over a decade now, I've also seen a lot of producers do the fermentation before the depulping, and I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I think they're different. And I think it's important to gather information on how it's done when we're dealing with a wash process. Was it fermented before or after the depulp? How long? This will allow us to start learning as we're tasting coffees. The seeds are then washed off after that fermentation and depulping, removing that mucilage. That seed needs to be dried to a specific moisture level and then stabilized. Typically, the parchment is left on, that paper substance around the seed, until the coffee is ready to ship. We're going to kind of hyper zoom up because that's the process. That's not the fermentation. That's the processing method on the fermentation that takes place within a wash. It's usually, from what I've seen, done from about 4 to 24 hours. Again, it can take place before or after the depulping and in a tank with or without water. Sometimes it's exposed completely to oxygen. Sometimes it's in a tank full of water. When it's full of water, is that aerobic or is that anaerobic? It's anaerobic because the water isn't taking place in there. Only a lactic fermentation can be taking place. The factors that affect this are the time, the temperature, the maturity of the coffee cherry. Is it ripe or is it green? And that affects the sugar content. If it is immersed in water in that tank, hydrolysis is also occurring, and it's allowing everything to kind of spread evenly, making washed a very uniform cup in comparison to other processing methods. Longer fermentations are likely to create some of the acids that we talked about, and this is known for bringing out clean, sweet acidity. We're going to remember that part because we're going to revisit that in our case studies. Clean, sweet acidity for washed, and again, it's more uniform. Okay, so our washed coffee, we've taken the fruit off and washed that seed. On the other side of the spectrum, we have our natural process. Natural process is where the coffee is dried directly in the fruit. So the coffee is picked, goes through its fermentation period, and then it's dried, typically on raised beds, also called African drying beds. When it's done drying, then the fruit is removed. It's depulped at that point, and it's typically stored in parchment until it's ready to be shipped. The fermentation for this I've seen go up to about 12 hours without becoming inconsistent. It can be done anaerobically or aerobically, but typically what I see at Origin is that it's done aerobically. The factors that affect this are the time, again, the temperature, the ability to oxidize, the maturity of the coffee cherry. What natural is known for is having a heavier body, possibly bringing out fruit tones, and being a sweeter cup. Now, this sweeter cup is going to lower your perceived acidity when you're consuming it. That doesn't mean that it actually has lower acidity in the cup. The pH might be the same as another one, but that higher sweetness is going to lower our perception of the acidity. One of the interesting things I kind of wanted to bring up here is that we see producers in Brazil and ones in Ethiopia say that as soon as I'm done picking this coffee, we put it directly on the raised beds. Why is Ethiopian coffee then so much more fruit forward than a Brazilian coffee, right? Well, besides the fact that they do have a lot more varieties in Ethiopia, they do have a lot more of that fruit forward taste. The Ethiopian coffees are typically picked out in the forest or wild. They're put into the baskets. They're walking around with it. It's actually going through a fermentation period still, while in Brazil, it's extremely efficient and it's picked right away and brought to a drying bed. And when it's exposed to the sun like that, it's starting to dry out and the fermentation is kind of halted or slowed quite a bit. We experience less fruit-forward flavors because of that partially. So we have our washed, we have our natural, and right in the middle of that, we have a honey process. The honey process is where the coffee fruit is picked and it is depulped, but it's not washed. That mucilage is able to remain on the coffee seed while it's drying. Again, the fermentation can kind of take place here before or after the depulp, and it does impact flavor quite a bit. At Origin, we do a lot of testing with those different methods to find out what's going to bring out the best flavor in the coffee. The seeds are then dried, and again, it's stored in parchment until it's ready to ship. This fermentation can take place, from what I've seen, up to about 24 hours without becoming inconsistent at a maximum. Now, there's some different factors, or one different factor that affects this one that I wanted to bring up here. The time, temperature, maturity of the coffee cherry, like we've already talked about, but also the amount of mucilage that's left on the coffee seed. If there's a little bit of mucilage left on it, the coffee parchment, that paper, the pergamino, turns or remains yellow. If you leave a lot of mucilage or pulp on that coffee seed, that parchment turns black. And somewhere in the middle is red. And that's where we get our yellow, red, and black honey process. Typically, the amount of mucilage that's left on the coffee seed, as well as the amount of fermentation that takes place, changes the color of that parchment. It would be safe to say that a black honey process would be a lot closer to a natural, and that a yellow honey process would be a lot closer to a washed, while the red is right in the middle. However, with honey process, you're kind of throwing darts at a board. They could be all over the place, so while we can make these assessments and predict what it might taste like, it could be completely inaccurate, and it needs to be done first and tasted. This is known for bringing out balanced acidity, body, and sweetness. Again, it's kind of right in there in the middle of that washed and natural process. I wanted to touch on two types of experimental fermentation, and I'd also really like to stop calling it experimental in the industry. I think that we should be calling it controlled. First of all, these aren't experimental fermentations. Yeast fermentation and anaerobic have been taking place for a long time. Second of all, they're not going to be experimental in the coffee industry in a couple more years, so that name can't stick permanently. What we're doing is we're controlling the fermentation period. With the yeast fermentation, by inputting yeast during that period, it's overriding the other bacteria, and we can begin to actually engineer some of the flavors that we're looking to create. Lal Cafe is one of the leaders in putting yeast forward and selling it to people who are doing specialty coffee. There's over 1,500 types of yeast that exist, and they're all going to impact the cup differently. And they've researched this and found a few that they say can create more floral tastes, more chocolatey tastes. And what they would say is it can't create something that wasn't already existent in the coffee, but it can amplify it. So by using certain yeasts, people can begin to give a coffee more body. Maybe there was a really fruit-forward, strawberry-tasting cup, but the body was super thin, and that threw off the balance. They're saying that they have a solution for this by controlling the fermentation with a specific yeast. Again, we are controlling the fermentation with an anaerobic. We are taking the oxygen out, and this is a nice picture right here that kind of shows you what that looks like. You can put carbon dioxide or even nitrogen into whatever type of tank you're using, or even bucket. you have to have a way for the oxygen to get out, but now that the oxygen is not present, we can do that fermentation like we talked about for a lot longer. So our coffee is now dried, or we think it's finished drying, and we need to talk about stability and the storage of that coffee. I'm testing some coffee here in Haiti, and by the look on my face, it was not the moisture level that I wanted it to be. SCA says that it should be between 9 and 13%. My company is a little bit more strict than that. We would do between 10 and 11.5 or 10 and 12 moisture level. We found that that extends the longevity of the coffee quite a bit. This is stored directly on concrete, which is also bad, and that's probably why the moisture was off, if it was off. It should be stored on wood. The concrete's going to fluctuate in temperature quite a bit, which makes the coffee lose moisture and gain moisture day to day. And if you've ever had like a beer that comes out of the fridge and back in and it starts to taste disgusting, this coffee is going to do a similar thing, that it's going to lose all of its like positive attributes and it's going to start just being overwhelmingly bitter. We like to store the coffee in that parchment, like I've said a few things, until it's ready to ship. And this coffee really needs to go through a resting period. Green coffee resting, we're not talking about resting after it's roasted. This is a green coffee resting period. You have to imagine this seed has been through a lot, okay? It grew out of nothing. The plant started flowering, a fruit was created, it was hard with no sugars, it started to mature, all these sugars were created, fermentation takes place, alcohols and acids, and we stripped that fruit and we washed it off and then it dried. These cell walls are not stable. By allowing that coffee to go through a reposo period at origin and not demand it to be shipped right away, we've seen about 6 weeks be very successful. By going through that 6 weeks, these cell walls become stable and we've been able to extend the longevity of our coffee. We've been doing that in Bolivia, in El Alto, which is at 4,000 meters above sea level. And we found that by resting the coffee there for a couple months before we ship it, has allowed the coffee to not taste like past crop, which is the term for coffee that's old. It becomes woody, it tastes like cardboard, it loses its sweetness, old coffee, for about 24 months. We're hoping to do a study in the next 2 years here, it's going to take about that long, where we have the cell walls analyzed from coffee that has gone through that reposo period and has not, and we're gonna line that up with the sensory data to kind of collaborate and find out, does it extend the longevity to stabilize the cell walls? Let's talk about how we can now taste that process. So quick recap, washed coffee is known for bringing out clean, sweet acidity, and remember it's likely to be the most uniform of these processing methods, the least inconsistent. Naturals are known for that heavier body, possible, and a nice mellow sweetness with a lower perceived acidity. Honeys can kind of range. Again, we need to keep that in mind, but yellow honey process is going to be probably closer to your washed, and black honey process is probably going to be closer to your natural. So if I was purchasing coffee of any of these different categories from all of these different processing methods, I would want to consider, does this coffee have qualities that I would like to bring out as a roaster, that my customers would like to experience? How does this fermentation or processing method impact the coffee, and is that something that I can bring out that my customers would enjoy? We're going to go through a few kind of case studies really quick on how I would go through some of that purchasing. So my producer in Colombia, Marta, and her sons Shadi and Ilias texted me and they said, Joey, we have an anaerobic 72-hour natural geisha. So what can I decipher from that before I have them send a sample? If I'm paying for this or if they're paying for it, regardless, this is very expensive. Geisha is extremely expensive coffee, and I don't want them to have to foot the bill for that, nor do I have time to sample roast everything without knowing if I actually am interested in it. A natural is known, again, for its body, potential fruit tones, sweetness, could be more inconsistent than a wash, not necessarily, but since this is done anaerobically, it's homogeneous. If they've done it correctly, I'm going to assume it's not going to be inconsistent at all. 72 hours is quite a long time. They've now controlled that fermentation, and I'm going to expect very heavy fruit tones, especially since this is a geisha. It's going to be bringing out a lot of those flavors, a heavy body, and a lot of sweetness. And it was, and we bought it. Maria Pacas is from the Pacas estate in El Salvador. Her great-grandfather actually was the first in the world to cultivate the Pacas variety of Arabica, and it was eventually named after their family. We've been working with them for about 7 years now, and she shot me a message on WhatsApp and said, I have a double fermentation washed Pacamara. Pacamaras are a little crazy variety. I'm expecting quite a bit to be going on there already. A side note, when someone says double fermentation, I would encourage you to always ask what they mean by that, because I have heard it explained differently in different origins and from different importers. So it's important to understand, what do you mean by double fermentation? In this specific circumstance, Maria meant that it was fermented before the depulp as well as after. That could potentially bring out some inconsistency. The fact that it was fermented both in the cherries and afterwards. Wash is usually known for its uniformity, its consistency, but I'm just gonna make sure that I do my diligence and I'm not just cupping 1 cup of this one. I'm going to make sure that I have at least 3 and triangulating to make sure all the cups are uniform, if not more. A fermentation before and after would also probably add some of that juicy acidity to the coffee that Pacamara already has. So while I'm watching for that inconsistency, I'm expecting a nice, juicy, clean cup. So the producers I just mentioned in Honduras that I was with last week, we started to do a yellow honey process with them maybe 4 years ago. How can I expect to know before I purchase this coffee, before I start having them produce 20, 30 sacks of this coffee, what to expect? We need to talk about what they're doing with this yellow honey process. Why is there just a little bit of mucilage that's still on it? So I would ask the question, how did you get just a little bit of mucilage on it? Because people are gonna have different answers for you, whether it's that they calibrated their depulper to be smaller, or more than likely, they used a little bit of water when it's going through the depulper in order to move the coffee faster. That's also called a semi-washed, but I think it's very fair to still call it a honey process because there's a lot of mucilage still left on the coffee. Semi-washed, yellow honey, same thing. This was done by putting a little bit of water through the depulper with the coffee. So I'm gonna assume this is gonna be very close to their washed coffee. If I was roasting it, I would approach it similar to how I've already approached roasting a washed coffee from the 18 rabbit microlots of Marcala, Honduras, because that's what I've already been doing. And this is probably going to be similar to it. I would expect it to be very sweet, smooth, maybe a little bit bright. Again, with the honey process, you can't be sure though. I want to give you guys a few notes of inconsistencies to watch for. If a coffee is becoming grassy, or it tastes grassy when you're having it, I'd say 9 times out of 10, what I've seen at origin is that green coffee cherries were picked and left in. I like to use the example at origin a lot where I'll give people fruits and have them taste them right there on the spot, whether they be coffee fruits or other fruits. Taste that green coffee fruit and taste the red one and explain the difference. The green one tastes hard, it tastes like grass. There's no sweetness to it, it's an unripe fruit. The red one is juicy, it has sweetness, it has flavor, and the same goes for other fruits as well. A green, hard mango and a nice juicy, yellow, ripe mango. A lot of times that grassiness that we experience in a cup is coming from unripe coffee cherries. The fast aging, I think, is an important one to kind of bring up here. Like I mentioned, the green coffee needs to go through that reposo period at origin, that resting period. Those cell walls, when they're not stable and the coffee is shipped right away, we found that coffee starts to age possibly after about 8 months or so. And it starts to taste like wood, cardboard, it's losing its sweetness. So if you buy like a really nice Ethiopian coffee that tastes super floral, it's like jasmine, it's sweet, it's really nice, and then 6 months later it's starting to fade, and after 8 or 9 months it's already starting to taste woody, they likely did not put that through a reposo period. And if you're dealing directly with the producers, you can then speak with the producers or the exporter, if it's Ethiopia, and you can talk to them about possibly doing that reposo period. If you're talking to an importer, you might want to bring that up and say, this has been aging faster. I've learned that coffee needs to go through a reposo period. Is that something you can talk to the producers about? And that communication is going to help the entire supply chain. It's going to help those producers, and it's going to help the importer too, because their coffee is not going to be going bad faster. It's going to help us as coffee roasters or cafe owners because we're going to have a better product. The inconsistency of sweetness and acidity is an interesting one. I just kind of want to touch on. We started working in Apollo, Bolivia. It's a region all the way up by the Amazon, and it's a protected area with all indigenous people. We were the first people to start growing coffee there, besides someone growing a couple plants in their yard for personal consumption. We started working there about 7 or 8 years ago. And 3 years ago now, there was a problem where I had to deny samples and lots from 3 of the producers that had started growing coffee from us. We take this really seriously. We're not importers that would cup coffee for people that just started growing coffee from us and be like, sorry, we're not buying it. So me and one of my team members, we flew down there for a month, and we spent an entire month going through with these 60 or 70 producers to visualize their entire process and help them figure out what was going wrong with the ones we had to deny. It's interesting because there was an inconsistency with sweetness and acidity that was pretty stark, and so we couldn't accept it. We went to their fermentation tanks where they were washing the coffee, and they were depulping the coffee into these concrete fermentation tanks. The water's put into it the next day after the fermentation's done, and then the coffee's washed. To fill it with water, you have to plug up the concrete. So they would put a soda bottle in it, and that's how they would fill it with water without the water coming out. Well, at night when they finished, they'd put the soda bottle back in, and they'd depulp the coffee. We found a lot of coffee liquid from the depulped fruit at the bottom. So we did some pH tests along with the producers there, and the next day we found that the coffee on the top that was exposed to oxygen was already at a 3.5 pH, which is a lower pH, higher acidity. And the one that was under the liquid, while the liquid does have more of a fermentation smell to it, it wasn't fermenting as fast. It was at a 4.2. It's a big difference. By showing them this with the pH and simply unplugging that tank, we were able to purchase those lots next year from those producers. So let's touch on how we can approach roasting these. You can take unlimited amount of classes on roasting and still be learning, and we don't have very long to cover this, but I'm going to give you a few pointers that I would use when I'm taking these coffees on, how I would roast them in my facility. This is kind of assuming everybody already has the general information that coffee goes through its drying period when it's roasted. We then have our Maillard section, our Maillard reaction, where the sugars are being caramelized, and we have our development phase that takes place after that first crack. I would ask myself, what specific characteristics do I want to bring out in this coffee? Does it have fruity notes? Does it have nice acidity? Is there something I want to bring out at a light roast by roasting it quicker? And these temperatures and times are not going to translate roaster to roaster, so you have to interpret them. Water boils at different elevations, at different temperatures, so you have to keep that in mind here. But I would probably roast on my roaster, a 30 kilo Mill City at sea level in Virginia. I would roast for about 9 minutes and 45 seconds if I wanted to bring that out. It would be a faster roast. If I wanted to bring out those fruit notes, if I wanted to bring out that acidity. Does this coffee not have acidity that I love? Maybe it's okay, but I don't really want to bring it out. I kind of want to bring out the body and the sweetness of that coffee. I would slow that coffee down during that Maillard phase, and I would caramelize the sugars more. I would create a heavier body and a sweeter cup and mute the acidity. So I have these 2 starting graphs that I would always start with, okay? These are just starting points. This isn't necessarily how I would just throw it in there and roast it, but I have these starting graphs. One of them is faster, one of them is slower. And I would then profile the roast. Profiling is where you take the trier along that graph. Let's say I'm doing that faster roast, and I want to bring out really nice fruit tones. This is that 72-hour anaerobic geisha. It tastes like mango and papaya. I really want to bring those out. So during first crack, I take my trier or my sampler, and I'm going to pull the coffee out for a spread to kind of understand what that section of the graph would taste like. Maybe at 400 degrees, 402, put it in a cup, 404, 406, 408, 410. I would then let that coffee rest for as long as I needed it to rest for post-roast, and I would cup that coffee side by side, moving the cups farther away from me that I didn't like and closer to me that I did like. And it tends to create a little bit of a slope where you find out 406 was the best temperature along that graph for that coffee. We're going to be posting this video here on our YouTube channel. If you guys want to subscribe to it, you're welcome to. It's free education. We're going to be going through things like profiling, the sections of the roast as well. So feel free to scan that if you'd like. It also has the seminar that was done at the Roast Summit on post-roast resting times, CO2 off-gassing of coffee after it's roasted, and the sensory perception. Again, I would rest this profile. I wouldn't just cup it the next day. SCA and CQI guidelines are 8 to 24 hours after you roast coffee that you cup it. Again, we published that study last year in June, and I believe it was in the September issue of Roast Magazine. And our data shows that of the 23 coffees I believe we studied over the course of 21 days, only one was optimal in that 8 to 24 hour period. Over 50% of the coffees were actually best on day 8 or later. If you'd like to see more about that, this is going to bring you directly to the study, and you can feel free to kind of dive into the data. We're not making any claims that you should wait 8 days for this. People always ask, cool, then how long should I let this coffee rest? If you ask that, then you don't understand the data that you're reading, because it tells us that all coffees need different amounts of time to age, and there's theories on why. I speculate that it's more or less bacteria is creating more or less CO2 in the coffee, but I think the data is really interesting, and it'll allow you to kind of study this yourself. If you're profiling a coffee, though, and you're not tasting what the customers are going to taste because you're cupping it on day 1, then you're not really profiling the coffee to the best ability for your customer. So to kind of finish up here, how would I purchase coffee? How would I interact with my coffee provider, whether they be a producer or an importer? I would ask details. I want to know more about the fermentation. I don't want to just know if this is a washed. If it's possible to have information, I'd like to know when the coffee was depulped. I'd like to know for how long the fermentation period was. I'd like to take this data and I'd like to start assessing it with the tastes of the coffee over time. You could start to establish your own thoughts, your own understanding of what certain things taste like, a double fermentation Pacamara washed, or simply that same coffee as a Pacamara washed. And then you can use this to be purchasing in the future as well as communicating it to your customer. I want to thank you guys so much for coming out. My booth is right outside there if you do have any other questions afterwards. And thanks again.